Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Hi, welcome to 2026 and the first episode of the year. Today's episode is on the philosophy of touch. As per our usual tradition, we are starting the year off with a philosophy of episode. And if you guessed correctly the sense that we were doing the episode on, give yourself a round of applause. I think touch is a very interesting topic. It's the first sense to develop in the womb, yet it's often overlooked. Apparently, it's developed in the seventh week of gestation. And touch is also interesting because it's hard to really define. It involves several dimensions. So it involves things like temperature, solidness, like whether it's a solid, liquid, gas, and texture, whether it's rough or soft, as well as weight, if it's heavy or light. So it's very dynamic. Um, it's also interesting because not only with touch, but with many other senses, there's a transferability of knowledge. So the philosopher Molyneux asked whether someone could learn what a cube from a sphere is using touch alone, and if someone that is blind and only can only rely on touch, if they would be able to recognize the object if they were to regain sight.
Um, I came across the same thought experiment, but I thought that was interesting to like compare vision and touch,
Mhm.
but also has more to do with cross-modal sensory perception rather than touch on its own or vision on
Mhm.
its own. I don't know. I wonder if anybody has ever been able to explore this in a human who was blind and had their vision restored, but I don't think it's like it would, I don't think that would be possible. Um, but I guess it did make me question, it did highlight to me that touch and vision are very different in the ways that they give us information about space because it seems obvious, but touch is much more immediate and we can only touch things that are physically close to us, whereas vision we can use to gauge our larger scale environments by seeing at a distance. And so touch is much more intimate than other senses. Even hearing is even more distant, can be even more distant, right? So that's a quality that I also wanted to highlight that makes touch interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that in terms of the directness of touch and things like sound and how it seems that sound occurs across a single medium or modality because, for example, when talking about other senses, we think a lot about tangible qualities and something the philosophers call intensive features that vary in intensity along a single dimension of variation. So, like with sound and vibration, it increases in intensity or frequency along a single dimension. But with touch, it's not just a single dimension. So instead of the experience of touch varying along a single dimension, our experience of touch can vary in many dimensions. Simply adding temperature into the mix affects that. So our experiences of hot and cold seem to vary in intensity in two opposite directions around a neutral point. So it doesn't have that same quality of intensiveness that you experience with such things like sound or smell, or color. Like colors can be brighter or dimmer, but it doesn't have this bidirectionalness that temperature and therefore touch has.
That's interesting. And also, there is this debate about whether touch is even a single modality, because as you pointed out, it has many different properties, um, more than the other senses in general. For example, not only temperature, but also texture. And there's a debate about whether pain is included in touch or a separate modality, which is still up to debate.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also interesting that with touch, it's not just whether it has all of these different modalities. There's also an aspect of subjectivity and awareness. So you need to have either own person bodily awareness or external touch awareness to be able to make sense of all of these different modalities, which I will get into a little bit later.
I think what's unique about touch is that integration of touch or somatosensory, as we normally refer to it in neuroscience, information into our sense of self, because it also influences our proprioception, which is like our ability to sense where we are in space. Or the classic example to explain the concept of proprioception is your ability to touch your nose. Like if you put your arm out, your ability to touch your nose by bending your elbow and accurately estimating where your nose will be. That is proprioception. And so touch gives us information not only about the external world, but also about ourselves, and thus, as you mentioned, shapes our sense of self. Whereas if you think about vision or hearing, of course, these are all also in complex ways related to our sense of self, but you can be more of an observer with those senses. Whereas with touch, there is more integration of the information to tell you where you are, and also there's more agency in the process because not only do you touch things, but you are also touched, and you cannot touch something without also being touched.
Yeah, yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool, this bidirectional aspect of it. It's cool, this subjective experience that we have with touch. And it also reminded me of that episode that we did on interoception and alexithymia. And I wonder if those that do have alexithymia have a very different experience of touch and their awareness of objects surrounding them.
That's a good point because neurologically, the touch systems, which we refer to as the somatosensory systems, are also very heavily integrated with brain regions that are involved in proprioception, as I mentioned, as well as interoceptive regions like the insula, as we covered also in that episode. And I'm not sure if there's been research on somatosensation in alexithymia, in those with alexithymia. But I know, for example, that in certain neurodevelopmental conditions like autism, there are known changes in somatosensation and perception of touch. And in these, and there's also a co-occurrence of changes in attention and interoception.
And you've essentially also described two main ideas in the philosophy of touch, which are more jargony, but I'll go into them a little bit as well. So they talk about how you can either have the body template theory, which is related to proprioception. So the idea is that touch is defined by the fact that tactile content matches proprioceptive content. But there are some objections about this.
Do you mean similar to the predictive coding theory, where our perception of touch is based on our expectation of proprioception?
Yeah, I think so. And then the other theory that is usually discussed is the body map theory, which is that tactile sensations are localized within the frame of reference provided by the mental representation of the space and body, which might actually be a bit closer to the predictive error idea. It's within the frame of expectations that you have. So if you were to like close your eyes and imagine your environment, um, that would be the set of expectations, and it would just be more about like the bird eye view angle of your environment, whereas the other one is more similar to interoception, where it's more about the bodily awareness and that the tactile content matches the proprioceptive content. But anyway, there's this debate about, I guess, what comes first, and a lot of it is around proprioception and the surrounding environment.
No, I think, yeah, that's interesting. I think our perception of touch could be primarily influenced by how it shapes our understanding of the external world or how it shapes our understanding of our internal world, roughly.
Yeah.
And this kind of links to one quote that I came across by the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who said that, so bear with me because the link might seem loose,
No.
but he said that smoothness is, if we use the example of a property of touch, smoothness is not a collection of similar pressures, but the way in which a surface utilizes the time occupied by our tactile exploration or modulates the movement of our hand. And so this said to me that the qualities of touch are defined by how they actually alter us.
That's very cool.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I really like the idea of objects have like almost like a temporal necessity. There's a link between how long you touch something to acquire a certain amount of information from it. That's very interesting.
Yes. Yeah. I like that use of the word time as well because I guess it also highlights, if you touch something, say, imagine with your hand, um, if you leave your hand there, you kind of lose the perception of its qualities. Like you can't feel velvetiness. Is that a property? You can't feel that if you're not stroking it. It's hard to feel the true softness of like a cat if you're not stroking it, but if you're just laying your hand there. Oh, actually, a week ago, I touched a snake for the first time. And, it just felt like nothing in a way. Okay, not to diminish the snake, but it was very cool and hard. And I felt like I wasn't gaining the true tactile properties of the snake because in order to do so, I would have to squeeze it, and I did not want to do that. So I think this also highlights how touch is very explorative. It doesn't have to be, but to get the fullest information, it has to be.
Yeah, I really like that. Um, that also made me think of that of for different aspect of touch again in regards to temperature, whether, for instance, holding a warm cup of tea might feel nice and soothing for the first few seconds, but if it's like scalding and you keep holding it, it's eventually going to burn you. So there's also
Mm.
a different experience that you have with things the longer you interact with them.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was then thinking about like vision as a comparison again and whether we have the same thing. And whilst we do adjust to like changes in darkness, it's not quite the same. Yeah, it's not quite the same, but mainly because I think with touch, there's more of a scale of pleasantness.
Mhm.
So, particularly in humans, affective touch is really important for our social experiences, and that means like touch that is pleasant. It plays a huge role in also just regulating stress responses and hormones in the body, and touch can actually have like several positive benefits for regulating pain, for example.
Mhm.
And I think this is also something that is unique because it can be particularly healing or therapeutic.
Yeah, I find it super interesting how, unlike, well, a little bit dissimilar to most of the other senses, with touch, there's a very clear distinction between pleasurable and unpleasurable. So, as well as self versus other. So, like, for example, you can't tickle yourself, but others can tickle you. So, there's a very clear divide in the effect that touch has, and whether it's you touching yourself or someone else touching you,
Mm.
as well as whether it's a wanted touch or not. Like if a stranger that you don't like is touching you, that's a very, very different sensation than like a family member giving you a hug, for example. And so it's interesting how the subjectivity, the interoception, and yeah, the interoception aspect of experiencing touch is so intertwined with the experience of touch. So it's not just about the contact with the object, it's very much about context.
Yes, it carries a lot of meaning, and I came across an interesting study that because I was interested in how touch shapes hormones, and one example of a hormone that it has been implicated in a lot is oxytocin, which we tend to refer to as like the love chemical. And in this study, they measured plasma oxytocin levels from people following touch experiences. In agreement with previous research, it found that touch from a romantic partner enhances plasma oxytocin levels. But interestingly, it also enhanced oxytocin release for touch from an unfamiliar stranger afterwards, which shows how it can regulate hormonal systems in the longer term. And then, even to add beyond that, females that were touched by an unfamiliar stranger first then had dampened oxytocin responses to touch from their partner afterwards. So this is evidence that touch does carry meaningful social information, and they also went on to explore and describe how this is modulated by stress pathway, like stress hormone pathways. And I thought it was interesting that it can have a bidirectional effect in the longer term, so not just in the immediate vicinity of a touch experience, where it can modulate how you perceive following events.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I find it really curious how it can impact and regulate someone to such an extent and even shape future experiences. You don't really see that as much with the other senses. And in relation again to temperature and how touch is such an inherently subjective experiences, like I recently have gotten really into saunas and cold baths, and
It's the season.
it's the season, yes. I'm a very like cold person. I never leave the house with less than like 3 layers on or four. Um, and for me, the thought of like taking a cold plunge in a 3 degree or a 1 degree water bath would be insane. But after you've been 20 minutes in an 80-degree sauna, it actually feels really nice and refreshing. And so again, it's interesting how it's so subjective. And also how temperature can be felt without necessarily being touched in a way. Because if you're in an environment where the weather is hot, but you're not necessarily touching water or a solid object, it's just the air, are you really being touched?
Right. And this, so as you were speaking, I was thinking, like, well, I guess that's not really touch perception, that's more temperature perception, which you could argue is a different modality. Um, but I was thinking about touch in the context of other animals. And this is because I'm going to say this again, but I've been reading a book called An Immense World by Ed Young, and it's about how different animals perceive the world differently using their various sense systems. And I was actually on the chapter on touch, and he was describing how different animals have touch systems or somatosensory systems to sense vibrations, like the lateral line in fish, or alligators have sensory bumps underneath their mouth, and sea snakes have similar sensory bumps on their heads, just to name a few examples. And these are used to detect water movement and pressure changes, which is why alligators, for example, sit in stillness and can sense when a prey is approaching so accurately, and react so quickly because of these extremely sensitive sensory bumps. And all this, like, so as I was reading this, I was thinking, obviously, this is very different to human touch because we don't have any systems that can sense vibratory changes, or do we? Because then I started thinking about human hearing and how hearing is based off of how vibrations are detected in the eardrum and then transferred to downstream structures. It's really just a whole drum kit in there responding to vibrations in the air. And so I thought this was a very interesting comparison between so-called somatosensory systems in some animals and like an auditory system in humans. And how do we actually define touch? Is it sensing vibrations? And can we therefore consider hearing as touch? Or should we not consider vibration sensing to be touch?
I think that's really interesting. And I love the idea that I'd like to think it is touch. And I love the visual of just a little drummer kit in our ear going off. Yeah, I think we probably do experience touch in ways that extend beyond the skin. I guess we can feel touch related things like in our teeth, in mucous membranes, perhaps even in our internal organs. So, and like on the eyes as well, if there's wind. So we have touch-like sensations in other places that extend beyond the skin. I do think perhaps we are being a little bit limited, thinking that touch only occurs at the skin level.
Yes, and yeah, but even within the skin, I mean, a lot of touch onto the skin would influence things deeper within like receptors in muscles or joints. And it's interesting. I wonder if people are actually able to feel their stomachs. I don't think I can. But I wanted to say another thing I've been thinking about in the past few days is how the experience of being in water feels like and swimming, and how essentially that's being touched by like a kind of a constant pressure across the body. And there's something very soothing. Of course, this is not for everyone, this is a subjective experience, but personally, I find it very soothing being in water. And I think it links to this concept also going back to proprioception of how when I'm in water, I kind of feel like I'm more together. Like you're more aware of it because you are being touched in a way compared to air.
I completely relate to that. I love being in water. I find I'm so at peace whenever I'm in water. And you're right, it is like, yeah, you are enveloped in this medium. The level of relaxation that I have with water afterwards, it equates to after having like received a massage or after having been in a sauna. I guess perhaps like a sauna is another good example because you're just enveloped by this wave of heat. Anything that involves being just completely immersed in something, it's such a unique experience that we don't have all the time. Yeah, I'm sure there's something very evolutionary about that, perhaps being, I don't know, mother's wombs and things, but it is so peaceful.
True, I didn't think about that either. But of course, we all start off as being in fluid. And I also wanted to touch on how expand on this idea of how subjective touch is by linking it to a bit of neuroscience, of course. But firstly, I wanted to mention like a really interesting concept that if you've studied neuroscience, you definitely come across. But in terms of how touch is represented in the brain, we have a map. This is similar across many sensory modalities, but in our cortex, where information is integrated in the brain, we have a map of somatosensory representation, and this is sometimes called the homunculus because it's represented in a visual way of a little human being where the body parts are scaled in size based on how much cortical space they take up. Yeah, and this only applies to humans, which is why it's called the homunculus. And for in this case, the hands, the lips, the tongue, and the face would take up a majority of the space. So if you don't know what a homunculus looks like, just Google it. But it's essentially a distorted human with huge hands and lips and a tiny torso and legs, showing the information that the brain prioritizes for tactile discrimination. But of course, beyond this basic representation in our brain of touch information, the brain also imparts an expectation onto the information that it is to be received. And in this way, we are able to imagine touch, and sometimes, and a really good example of this is an illusion called the rubber hand illusion. So it's quite a common illusion where imagine that you're sitting at a table and in front of you is a rubber hand, and your own hand is hidden from your view. So now someone gently strokes that rubber hand, and at the same time, your hidden hand is stroked in exactly the same way. You will then begin to feel the touch in the rubber hand. So once you take mental ownership of that rubber hand, you will feel the touch sensations as if they are being done to yourself. And the classic example is that if somebody then hammers the hand, you quickly will retract your own hand, even though it was in no danger whatsoever. And so this rubber hand illusion shows that we are able to attribute touch sensations to other objects if we view them as part of ourselves. And so this tells us that your sense of touch is not only guided by the skin or by the peripheral receptors, but also by the brain's model of the body.
Yeah, those experiments are really cool, and they've also shown similar experiments with like phantom limb experiences. Yeah, it really speaks to how, again, I think it's interesting that all of our senses do talk to each other a little bit, and how there is redundancy a little bit in the information that we acquire from our senses, which is probably like an evolutionary advantage. So yeah, very cool. In preparation for this episode, I also spoke to some people about what they thought about the topic of touch. And I had some interesting conversations. And one thing that's stuck with me was, again, we live in a society that I think is driven a lot by the digital, by screens, our computers, our screens, like there's screens on the TV, there's screens on our phone. Our phones used to have like numbers on them that we would press, and like books, a lot of them are digital, and I wonder if there's a loss of information by becoming so digital. There's the obvious things that are a lot harder to do on a screen. So like playing instruments, feeling the keyboard keys, feeling the strings on a guitar, but also with things that have been translated quite more easily into digital, such as books, like holding a book, smelling a book, feeling the pages as you turn. And that kind of inspired me and made me want to, I guess, engage with my sense of touch a bit more. I wonder if also that's why some people in our generation have such a love for the analog, like are going back to like vinyl records and things like that. I do wonder if there's something about the human experience we lose when we digitize everything. Even something as simple as like pressing the keyboards on the phone, or pressing the keypads on the phone to dial a number. Now it's all just one dimensional. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting topic.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I was also thinking about how the pandemic in particular has reduced our use of touch in social situations. And whilst, that was necessary for, uh, because of social distancing, etc., it has probably stuck with many of us. And so social touch, I think, is less common nowadays. And I think that then led me to read up a lot about all of the benefits of touch, and like you discover like a newfound appreciation for touch, which is nice because I feel like every philosophy of a sense episode that we've done has made me like appreciate it more. So it's essentially just a journey of mindfulness. But it actually surprised me how much, how beneficial touch can be for regulating um, stress or emotions, and also just forming social bonds, and how it can also be rewarding and really important for bonding, and particularly in development as well. touch is really important for development from very early on. And this can be like really simply implemented as well. For example, I came across a study that was looking at how mechanosensory touch can influence the outcomes of premature infants. And I was surprised to find out that 10 days of just like holding premature infants was enough to significantly increase their weight gain compared to premature infants that did not have additional touch, even though their caloric intake was the same. And it also led to more mature habituation, orientation, and also motor behaviors in premature infants that lasted 8 and 12 months. They also observed more mature habituation, orientation, and motor behaviors in the premature infants with touch 8 and 12 months after the touch therapy. And so overall, this shows how powerful mechanosensory touch is for general development and cognitive development as well. And yeah, really just highlights this idea that, as with many different sensory modalities, it's very necessary for proper development.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's so powerful. I hadn't realized that infants could recover that quickly just from touch alone.
I know.
As we've discussed, clearly touch is such an essential part of our human experience. And I think it's interesting how there's a lot of visual art, but there isn't a lot of touch art. And I think there should be. I think that would be a really cool museum.
That honestly sounds a little bit scary. Like, I
Yeah.
feel like, what are there just going to be like, oh my gosh, you know what it's like? It's like, have you seen Finding Dory?
No. Oh, yes.
Oh, you
Well,
know
have
the
I?
touch pool? Do you know the
No, I
touch pool in
haven't.
the aquarium? No.
No.
Okay. Damn it. That would
What
have
is
been a
it?
good example. So you know how in aquariums there are like touch pools where children can go and like touch the starfish and like pick up the coral or I don't know whatever they have in there. And
Mhm.
in Finding Dory, there's a scene where like the animals um are scared every time they open the touch pool because all the humans come and like touch them, right? So I feel like touch art would involve like me being touched by things I don't want to be touched with.
Yeah, maybe it would be a scary experience, but it's interesting how there aren't many mediums that appreciate the touch. Like there aren't many artworks. There is this artist called Kursemeyer where she has explored the different ways direct contact with objects mediated by touch can offer a sense of authenticity and value to an object that you cannot get through another modality. And there have been a few tangible art installations that encourage rather than prohibit direct contact and exploration. And if you think about it, like there could be a museum for people who are blind and be able to experience art in a different way.
Mm. Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. Like exploratory art, like exploring through touch
Yeah.
would be actually a really good museum concept.
Yeah.
That just reminded me like of as a child, I explored things heavily through touch. And I remember like if I would ever go into like an antique shop or like any shop for that matter, I would just touch everything. And I think that's very common as children, but then we get told not to. And
Mm.
when we grow up, we hold ourselves back from touching things. But I think it's a very natural human tendency to explore through touch.
Yeah, I like that. I'm gonna start touching everything I see in shops again now. Yeah.
Not in the lab though.
No. Only with gloves and
Only
maybe,
with gloves,
yeah.
yeah.
So that's basically all my thoughts on touch. I do have one more question after such a nice interoceptive episode. I wanted to ask the question, is water wet?
Oh no. Not this again. Well, okay, from a touch perspective, obviously, yes. But I
Okay.
think that really answers the question, actually. because you have to ask from a touch perspective or from a water perspective.
Yep. And given I'm a human, I'm gonna answer from the human perspective.
Yes.
I love how deeply you
Sorry.
think.
Yeah, because I was also thinking about humidity and how whether or not how humidity does feel wet, and water is essentially your greatest possible humidity, right? And then how we were talking about being in water and how it feels. Well, personally, having also just returned back from Singapore, I find being in a humid environment very soothing, partially because of nostalgia, but also just because of the, I don't know, increased tension you feel in the air, like you're more in contact with the air.
I like
Yeah.
that.
Not that that tells us anything about whether water is wet. I have no more comments on that. What do you think?
I think water is wet, yes.
Okay, simple.
Yeah, solved it. Cool. Well, that concludes our first episode of the year. I hope you liked it. Um, Leave in the comments your thoughts on touch and if water is wet. And check out all of our resources on our website, neuroversepod.com. And let us know what you think about our episodes on our social media page at neuroverse_pod.
Thank you for listening. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to check out our Twitter and Instagram at neuroverse_pod, and for more information, check out our website, neuroversepod.com. Thank you for all your support. We really appreciate it.